The Ministry of International Needs isn't your typical Western missionary organization because we don't send Western missionaries. Oh, that's different. And your church recently has started supporting Jacob Hiagbi in Ghana. And I don't think he's ever been to America, has he, Bob? No. These missionaries are in their country serving their own people. Some of them are barefoot evangelists in the hills in Nepal. We support about 600 evangelists and church planters around the world, many of them who don't even speak English. Jacob does speak English, and Brother Bob and his wife Jean ministered there for a few years, 11 years, I think. And that's how we made this connection with your church and our ministry. I met Bob when I first moved to Linden, and he said, "Isn't that the ministry that Walter Pimpong and Jacob Hiagbi work with?" And now your church is involved in supporting that. So I really appreciate your church and your concern for what the Lord is doing through indigenous workers. Not just, we need to have churches that not only have white faces on their missionary map, but Indian faces and African faces that you are supporting and recognizing what the Lord is doing through brothers and sisters who are ministering among their own people and really carrying the torch of what American missionaries have started. And in some cases, our missionaries were brought up in without any contact with Western missionaries. And it's amazing to see that we're involved in 30 countries altogether. Tremendous things happening in all of those. But you're going to have to come tonight to hear more details about that. Or wish you were here in Sunday school class where you heard an hour's worth of details about that. But I'm going to share a few as we go through this morning. But for now, I'm wanting to ask the question, who is my neighbor? And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Just several things in my life caused me to come to this question. And probably the main time was as I was flying to Vietnam. I read the book of what's his name? Richard Stearns, A Hole in Our Gospel. I read that book, and I think he asked the question in the book, but as I was going to Vietnam, this question kept coming to me. And as we look at the Old Testament, we need to ask ourselves this in question as well as we look at this issue. And if we take a brief look at the Old Testament, for living in harmony, Moses gave 613 laws. And these were to help build the community, and many of these laws referred to our neighbor. If you look at, Leviticus, I wrote it down here somewhere, Leviticus 19:18, that's where it starts. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself is throughout the Old Testament, and then we see it in the New Testament as well as one of the most important commandments. So as we look through the Old Testament, about 500 years later, David, in the 15th Psalm, reduced those 613 to 11 sort of laws or commands. Isaiah, in his opening chapter, reduced them further to even 6. And then if we look at Micah, in his 6th chapter, he narrowed them down to 3. To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. And I know you all have read the parable of the Good Samaritan, but I just had to bring this up today. And Brother Steve said it's been a long time since you've looked at it as a church. So turn to Luke chapter 10. We are going to read it. And I know you've heard it before, but I think it's an important thing to think about. And I'm thinking of our neighborhood as not only the community we are living in here, and you have the biker church down the road and the banditos living nearby, and you live in a very interesting neighborhood. And I recently met with some of the banditos. It was a very encouraging meeting. And the Trinity Biker Church is doing an amazing job. And your church is doing an amazing job in reaching out to the community here. And each of us should have the goal of making your neighborhood a better place to live, following those scripture principles. It's nice to have good neighbors, isn't it? And it's really good if you're a good neighbor. Oh, if you ever have lived in a neighborhood where you have a problem neighbor, it is a royal pain. We need to love our neighbor and work together to have a good neighborhood. So Jesus, in the 22nd chapter of Matthew, he was asked by a lawyer, what is the greatest commandment? And of course, he was sort of wanting to have a trick question. The point was to see if he would anger the political leaders or the religious leaders who dictated the social and religious practices with scores of laws, and Jesus knew their intent, and he surprised them. He did not reduce the laws to one. He could have done that based on Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. Instead, he reduced them down to two: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your strength, all your soul, and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands hang all of the laws and the prophets. And it's interesting to know that if you follow that first command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you will not break the first 4 or 10 commandments. And if you love your neighbor as yourself, you won't break the last 6 commandments. So that's why all the law and all the prophets hang on those two. And further, it's going to go a long way to covering those 613 commandments that Moses presented in the Old Testament. I saw this t-shirt that really impacted me, and I just had to take the picture. A neighbor isn't necessarily someone just like us. Jesus expands the definition of neighbor well beyond family and friends and co-workers, ethnicity, or those who live near us. And we have an interesting situation here in Whatcom County. We had a lot of Russians come here about 20 years ago, and hopefully we're ministering to them. And we have many Punjabis as our neighbors. And in fact, in Linden, we started a sort of a committee or an emphasis called Friends of Our Punjabi Neighbors, just to encourage people to welcome the Punjabis to our community. We have at least 5,000 in Whatcom County, and more will be coming, I'm sure. We need to reach out to neighbors who may be different from us. We need to make our neighborhood a better place. There are so many points we can pull from this parable in Luke chapter 10. But starting in verse 25, this is where the expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. And we already read the verse about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. That's what the lawyer answered. The lawyer told Jesus this is what he had found in the law. Jesus said, "You have answered correctly," in verse 28. "Do this, and you will live." But the lawyer wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Now, I'm not sure which syllable he put the emphasis on, but there's a lot of ways we can say that. Who is my neighbor? Or who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? There's a lot of different ways of asking that, but we need to be asking ourselves this question. And this is what the lawyer did, and Jesus had a good reply. "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell among the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for the extra expense you may have.' And which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" And the expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." A neighbor isn't necessarily someone just like us. We need to be reaching out to in every opportunity, going out of our way to find opportunities to ministry. And there are so many points we can pull from this parable, but I want to look at 3 categories of people that are in there, 3 reactions to this situation. And I've actually never heard anybody bring up these 3 points, but I learned them from my associate in Zambia when I was there last year, when Zambia was my neighborhood for 3 weeks. The first point is the robber. The thieves say, "What is yours is mine, and I will take it." I hope none of us have that thought or that mentality or that worldview, and I'm sure we don't. But this kind of thing is going on all the time. We see it in the news, and hopefully none of us are of that mentality. But we need to minister to people that are of that mentality. I could give a lot of examples of that, but since Persecuted Church Sunday is coming up very soon, and I forgot to read the news during the break between Sunday school and church, but I looked at the news when I woke up this morning and found a few things that are still happening around the world. And can you imagine if you were in Nigeria, where for the last few years, the last 4 years, almost every Sunday, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this, almost every Sunday a church is bombed. Unbelievable. We're not even hearing about it much anymore. But this is in the city of Maiduguri, and it's in the news again today, this morning. These pictures were of a few months ago when a church was bombed. But this morning they caught 4 suicide bombers going into the city of Maiduguri. We don't know what their intents were, whether they were to bomb the churches or what. But ISIS is not only concentrating on Christians now. On Friday, one of those suicide bombers made it into a mosque, set off a bomb, and 42 people were killed. Now, almost every Sunday, and I'm waiting to hear what happened this Sunday, but they caught 4 suicide bombers going into that city, and probably at least 1 or 2 of them purpose was to go and bomb a church. And when you think of bombing a church and you hear that 101 people were killed, or as happened on Friday, 42 people are killed, a bomb does so much damage, as you see to the church there. And as we saw when it hit closer to home, the Boston Marathon bombing that happened, yes, only a few people were killed, but many lost their limbs, many lost their eyesight, many were deaf because of the bomb went off. And when you hear 42 people killed in a church or in a mosque, you can just imagine that 100 more at least are seriously wounded. And it's going to be affecting them for the rest of their life. And I ask myself the question, if I knew a church was going to be bombed every Sunday somewhere north of Seattle, would I go to church? I'm not going to answer that. But ask yourself that question. If you knew at least one church was going to be bombed every Sunday north of Seattle, and that's similar to what our brothers and sisters are going through in Nigeria, would you come to church? I'm not going to ask for your answer either. But this kind of thing is going on all the time in Nigeria and in Sudan. And I've talked to missionaries from Nigeria and Sudan about what is happening now, missionaries who lived there in the 60s and 70s, and they said, so what's new? Christians who live in Egypt are saying the same thing. So what's new? And it's kind of shocking to know this has been going on for 50 years in Nigeria and in Sudan. The persecution has been there. And I hadn't even thought of it being that bad 50 years ago. But it was terrible. And yes, we're hearing more about it in the news, at least 3 years ago, but now it's kind of dropped off our radar. We did hear of the bombing of Charlie Hebdo in France was in January. We heard about that, but did we hear that on that 2 days before that, 2,000 Nigerians were killed in a village, most of them Christians, 2 days before the Charlie Hebdo thing happened in France. And the France issue kind of overwhelmed us, and we didn't hear much about the 2,000 in Nigeria. And people were identifying with Charlie, saying, Je suis Charlie, or I am Charlie in French. But I say, Je ne suis pas Charlie, Je suis Nigeria. Let's identify with Nigeria. And about that time that ISIS came up, many people were posting this even as their Facebook profile picture. I'm sure you've seen it. I've lived in Muslim countries that are 99% Muslim, 99.99% Muslim. And I'm not sure, I don't think, if I were living in Morocco, I would not put that on my door. I would not wear that as a t-shirt. But people are trying to identify with the persecuted church. That stands for Nazarene or Christian. And this was actually posted on the homes of some people who are Christians. And ISIS has gone through and eliminated those people who have been identified as a Christian. This is happening around the world. On the day, I mentioned the Boston Marathon bombing, but the day that the Boston Marathon bombing happened, did we hear about the 29 bombs that went off in Africa? Or the 25 bombs in Iraq on that same day as our Boston Marathon bombing? Did we hear about the 29 children and one teacher that were gunned down in school in Nigeria that day? Of course, it's only natural to be more concerned when it's closer to home. That is only natural. So I don't want to convict you too much on this, but we did hear about that time of the 300 girls that were kidnapped by the Boko Haram in Nigeria. Because that happened all at once, we did hear about it. But this has been going on for years. 600 Christian girls have been kidnapped in Egypt over the last 3 years. Not all at once, so we haven't even heard about it. But girls from my friend in Egypt, girls from his own church have been kidnapped. One girl was shot walking home from a Bible study that was at my friend's church in Egypt. And I told his story briefly in the Sunday school hour, but I have his book. He spoke in our church 2 weeks ago on Sunday night, and he wrote a book of his testimony of his life in Egypt. So I'd like to encourage you, if you weren't in Sunday school this morning, to get that book and read what life is like as a believer in Egypt. It's on the back table. You can talk to me about how to get one. If we need to be concerned about our next door neighbor, but if we aren't even reaching out to our next door neighbor, how are we going to convince people to help our neighbors 10,000 miles away? I could say so much more, but why do we consider the Boston people our neighbor, but Nigeria not? We need to have that concern. So that was the goal of the robbers and the thieves. What is yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. We see that in our world today, and as believers, we need to combat that. But we have a second viewpoint of the priests and the Levite example in our story who saw the man bleeding in the ditch. They walked by and said, "What is mine, and I'm just going to keep it." We do see that attitude a lot. And as I speak in churches like I'm doing today, I've had people come up to me and said, "Yeah, but why do we need to help the needy people over there? We need to help the people right here in America." And I've said this several times, and I feel bad in a way, but I say, that is so true. What are you doing to help the needy right here in America? Well, I pay my taxes, and we help the needy here in America. But often it's people with that attitude that aren't helping at all, that they're saying, what is mine, and I'm going to keep it. I was watching one of those goofy reality shows when someone came knocking. They were just filming a family going through their day-to-day activities. Someone knocked on the door of this home, and the TV cameras were there, and the little girl was asking for $8 for a charity. I don't remember what it was. But this man said, for all the world to hear, and I even rewound it and listened to it several times, "I have never given anything to charity, and I'm sure not going to start now. It's every man for himself in this world." So I hope none of us here are in this category either, where we'll walk by someone who is in need and want to keep what we have for ourselves. And we're talking time, keep our time for ourselves, keep our money for ourselves. But again, it's very natural to be concerned for our own first, for our own family, for our own neighbors, for those in our city who are homeless. Yes, it's very natural to think about those first. And we do. We have that responsibility because they are close to us. But I'm just trying to encourage you to have some part of your heart be concerned for the rest of the world too, and think of a larger neighborhood. When a Boeing 767, it usually configured for about 256 passengers, and we do pay attention when something like that crashes and everyone on board is killed. And then we hear who was on that plane. And I remember one time, 20-some years ago, we heard that, there were some Americans that crashed on that plane in Mexico. And so we perked up our interest a little more when we hear Americans are on that plane. And then we heard, they were from Washington. Well, we got a little more concerned. And then, they were from Linden. I don't know if you remember that plane crash, but they were missionaries. They were going to Mexico that were killed on a plane. And of course, that comes closer to home, and that's only natural. And then some people in Linden, a lot of people in Linden knew them. And then they're concerned for the children that couple left behind. It's only natural and normal to care about those closest to us. We can't care for everyone. We drive ourselves crazy. But again, we need to have part of our heart, part of our concern be for the rest of the world. And Richard Stearns, when he wrote that book, he's the president of World Vision, he did some research when he wrote the book, A Hole in Our Gospel, and this impacted me. He said, 100 airliners are crashing every day. 265 on each plane, 26,500 deaths by starvation and or preventable diseases. 100 airliners are crashing every day. This is from the research that he came up with. Wow. We really hear about it when a plane crashes, but our mind has become numb. And I'll have to admit, as I've lived around the world, my heart is hardened too. I hear about it so much, and especially since I receive all the missionary newsletters, and I hear every day about, or every Sunday about these Nigerian churches being bombed, or some of the Boko Haram, which is similar to ISIS, is carrying out murders and killing Christians on purpose. I'm getting kind of numb to it too. So it's kind of natural, and I do understand. But I read this book on my trip to Vietnam, and that comment really impacted me. Who is my neighbor? And this question haunted me the whole time I was in Vietnam with my wife. My wife and I used my frequent flyer miles to go to Vietnam for our vacation. It's crazy to do missions on our vacation, but it was so encouraging in some ways. Let me tell you briefly of our neighborhood in Vietnam for 3 weeks. There's a church in Linden. Mike Kirkley has a strong connection with a church in Vietnam. So we visited that church, and it's a part of our ministry, and we sponsor about 50 evangelists in Vietnam. We just had last minute, we found free tickets, so the next day got on the plane and went. And we were there for Christmas. So we went to this church on Christmas Eve. They had a special ceremony. And we didn't really know too much about the background of this church. But on Christmas morning, here is a church of 250 people. They held up a piece of paper, and the people cheered. We are now legally allowed to meet as a church. They had just got the paper that week. Now, this whole church had been taken to prison twice in the past couple of years for worshiping, because they refused to stop worshiping. The police came in and took all 250, well, one time it was about 200 people, the other time it was about 250, took them all down to jail and put them in jail for a couple days. And then it happened again. The second time they brought buses and bused them all to jail. Now this kind of caught the attention of the world, and some churches in Linden who are sort of sister churches with this church. And because of the popularity of this, because it was publicized, the government gave them permission to meet, even though they were not a registered church. So it's one of the first times this happened in Vietnam. It was such a privilege to worship with this church on Christmas Day. To know they had been through so much persecution and so many trials in their lives. The pastors had been in prison many times, and Mike Kirkley and Pastor Ryan Bima, almost got put in jail. They're from Linden, when they were there because they were holding sort of an underground seminary. And they were, the police came in, and they didn't go to jail, but it was looking close. So we do experience this on a regular basis. But we don't want to have that attitude of what's mine is mine and I will keep it. We want to have this attitude. What is mine is yours and I will give it. And I really feel that's one of the ways we can identify with the homeless. It's one of the ways we can identify with the persecuted church. I don't wish that kind of persecution on us here in America. The persecution we've been talking about, and I understand Steve's going to be bringing that up over the next month. I wrote a whole seminary thesis paper on persecution through the ages, studying it right from the book of Acts through the 2nd century. And I almost wanted to preach that sermon today since it's so close to Persecuted Church Sunday, but wow, persecution has been happening forever and it's going to continue. But we need to identify with our brothers and sisters, and we're going to be forced to make a stand here in America as we are over the last few laws that have happened in this country. But this really impacted me when I saw this picture. We need to identify with those who are suffering. And one of the ways we can do that is through giving. That is really, and praying for them, being involved in ministry to them, and through giving. That could be me, sitting on the street corner. I'm serious, that could be me. And we need to realize that could be me. That could be you. You've probably heard of the rock band U2. I actually went to their concert once. They have a song that recently came out last year called, or one of the phrases they keep repeating is, "There is no them, there's only us." So often we have a them versus us mentality. I really like that song. They keep repeating that. There is no them, there's only us. We're in this together, especially with our neighbors locally, but also with our church and the ministry involvement through missions around the world. We need to have that attitude. There is no them, there's only us. What is mine is yours, and I will give it. Christianity Today did a cover story, that's a couple of years ago now, but the title on the cover was, "You want to change the world? Sponsor a child." A top economist shares the astounding news about that picture hanging on your refrigerator. Child sponsorship works. I'm not going to go into all the details of that article, but the bottom line is they followed children who had been sponsored from a very young age, and we have that example in Ghana. I'll share that with you tonight. So many examples in Ghana where we have followed the children through, and that sponsorship that we did when they were young, getting them to school instead of being on the streets, has really made a difference in their lives. So Christianity Today and so a group that was doing their doctoral thesis studied child sponsorship, and I'm not going to go into the details, but the bottom line is child sponsorship works. That's one way we can be concerned for our neighbors in other countries, is through sponsoring a child. And we actually have some 10 profiles on the back of children from Ghana that you can sponsor, and come tonight to hear more about that. How's that for a neighborhood? One of the largest slums in the world in our ministry in Kenya is right there. 800,000, maybe 1 million people living in a 3 square mile area. And when you think of Linden, it's about 3 square miles, right? Ferndale, a little smaller maybe. You know how many people are there in Linden? 12,000. In an area that size, 800,000 people living in sewer running down the street, poor sanitation, a lot of disease. How would you like that for your neighborhood? The slum I was in Colombia wasn't near that bad, and I never did get to visit this slum in Nairobi, Kenya. But there was a sort of a slum in Zambia that became my neighborhood for 3 weeks. But it was a clean slum, no electricity, no running water, but it was clean. And this is the school that was in Zambia. It was a privilege for me to spend 3 weeks in this neighborhood, and I still consider them my neighbors. We sponsor a child there. And I look at this family. These are the kids. Their parents have died of AIDS. And the older kids are taking care of the younger kids. And the young lady in that picture married really young, a man who could provide for them. And that's her baby that's in the picture. And her husband was away at work when I was there. But this kind of situation of siblings raising their other siblings is common in this village in Zambia and common throughout Africa, where many parents are dying of AIDS. I go to the next village, and this young lady's husband has passed away from AIDS, and you can see she is very thin, and she will probably pass away soon. So we found sponsors for those 2 kids, and they will live with guardians. It was such a privilege to meet with the whole group. We're helping 300 children in this village, but many more need help. And I was really impressed by this neighborhood. Yes, there's a lot of alcoholism. The trucks come in and just pour the beer into a barrel at the bars, and the people are consumed with that dirty beer just being poured. So you see the problems in this neighborhood, but the Christians are really making a difference. These 9 caregivers are taking care of the children, being sure they're in school, visiting the homes, giving food to the families who are taking care of the orphans to help them out, and paying the school fees, and visiting the schools on a regular basis to check their report cards and everything. So these 9 caregivers are making a difference, and they are volunteer. And I asked them if they had any needs, and one of the ladies humbly came to me and said, well, we have to walk for many miles in the hot sun and in the rain at other times. We would like umbrellas to shield us. And believe me, I got heat stroke while I was there because I forgot my hat and I couldn't find a hat. I didn't pass out, but I was shaking. As soon as I drank water, I was fine. These people are out in that hot sun, very hot, and then the rain at other times. They said, we would like umbrellas. And then they said, if possible, we would like uniforms so we can be identified as social workers in our communities. And that cost only $20 each. And I just gave them the money for that. And then I said, are there any other needs? No, if you did that, that would be wonderful. Well, we started paying them about $20 a month too for the work they're doing. And surprised them with bicycles, because one of them had a bike. The one that had to travel the furthest borrowed a bike. And when we gave them all a bicycle, they can do so much more. Just the heart of the people that are there with a concern for reaching their own neighbors really blessed me. Then I visited this home, and our daughter wanted me to specifically find this home because she sponsored a child from this family. And I didn't know what I was going to be encountering when I walked up to that home, but the grandmother she has 13 grandchildren now without parents because all of her own children and spouses have died of AIDS. All of them. 13 grandchildren. She's taken care of 7 in this house. But as I came up to the house, she was scooting out on a plastic mat, and the children were helping her. And I asked, and they said, she can't walk. She's crippled. So she is taking care of 7 of her grandchildren, but they're also helping take care of her. A nice, fairly nice, clean home to live in. No water, no electricity, but they get water from a well, clean water from a well. It was such a blessing for me to be a part of this neighborhood, to meet the child that my daughter sponsors. And then they had never thought of getting her a wheelchair. They didn't have the money for that. But a wheelchair only cost about $250. And there's actually a Lions Club in Lusaka, Zambia, that was able to get her a wheelchair, and we paid for that. And the ground around there is fine for a wheelchair. So what a blessing that we were able to help in that way. Deuteronomy 10, verse 18 and 19 says, "He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. As you love those who are alien, and you are to love those who are aliens, for you yourselves were aliens in Egypt." Something else that was in the news this morning, and it's coming close to home too, is what do we do with the illegal immigrants that are coming. And there's about 6 million Syrians have fled Syria into neighboring countries. And this morning they said yesterday was the highest number of refugees ever to go through the Croatian border. Now they've come a long way, through Turkey, through Greece, up through Macedonia, and now into Croatia. Hungary has rejected any more. 11,500 refugees came through Croatia yesterday into the refugee camp. And this is happening daily. And it's going to continue to happen. And then in the news this morning, you may have seen it, there was a protest in London where people were in favor of allowing more immigrants from Syria and others were against it, and they had a riot. Molotov cocktails were flying, and I haven't heard the final result of what happened at the train station in England today. But these are some of the issues we are going to be faced with as we hear it coming up so much with this election. What do we do with the immigration that's going on? Do we accept Syrian refugees? I'm not going to give my comment on that, but that's a question we need to be asking ourselves as we think about that question, who is my neighbor? I want to share this. I shared this in Sunday school, but this was the headline the last day that I was in Turkey 1 year ago this week. Christian students to have their own religious classes. Now, the Christians there were prepared when the government asked them. They had a Sunday school curriculum already prepared. And when the government asked them if the children in the Muslim schools could have a Bible class instead of having to go to the Muslim classes, the believers there had already had a Sunday school curriculum, and they were able to introduce it. So in Turkey, a country that's 98% Muslim, now has Bible classes in the public schools. Isn't that amazing? And it was such a privilege. We'd been working on this for a year, and to see that headline in the papers the last day we were there was so encouraging for the group of 100 that I was with to see this coming to fruition. I wish I could share more details about that, but we're running short of time. What does all of this mean? Very simply, we should be good neighbors, but we should have an expanded definition of that word neighbor. And the reason there are fewer and fewer true good neighborhoods is because there are fewer and fewer true good neighbors. I look at my neighborhood. I moved in there, and I didn't even meet my neighbors. It was winter, and everybody just drove their cars right in their house quickly and shut the door behind them. Garage door openers are a serious hindrance to a neighborhood. But we need to work on that. And we just had a neighborhood block party in our neighborhood. It was a real blessing. We've created a neighborhood block party Facebook group, and now we see, whose dog is that barking at 3 a.m? And we're able to resolve some of the issues through this Facebook page and our neighborhood block party. So I would encourage you to try something like that in your neighborhood. There's a lot more I want to share, so come tonight if you want to hear more. But I heard a comedian say this one time, and let's not be like this comedian. And I hope he was just joking when he said this. Yeah, I used to sponsor a child somewhere in Africa. The picture was hanging on our fridge. But then I found out for that same amount of money, I could buy a coffee every day. Well, it's not funny, but he was trying to be funny. But I hope we don't have that attitude, because that little amount can make a real difference in a child's life. And let's not be like that man on that reality show that said, who refused to give $8 and say, what is mine, and I'm going to keep it. His quote still rings with me. It's every man for himself in this world. And there are too many people that have that attitude. But we should have the attitude of what is mine is yours, and I will give it.